Welcome to the Bad Roman Podcast. On this show, we talk with veterans, community leaders, Christians and non-Christians as we explore the entanglement of Christians with the state. The Bad Roman Project was created out of the firm belief that as Christians, we are called to follow Christ, not the state. Here is your host, Craig Hargis.
Hey, folks. Today I have John and Micah, the host of the City Square podcast on the show, and we're going to discuss eschatology, which is something we haven't focused too much on with the Bad Roman. So let's get into it a little bit.
Let's go. Yep. Left, right, left, right, left. We got our marching orders, man. Left, right. Would you rather serve God than serve Caesar, you feel me? Right. I'm just trying to live what he said. I'm just trying to live what he said. I ain't scared. I will take one to the head. Go ahead. I'm just trying to live what he said. I ain't scared. I will take one to the head. Go ahead. So it's safe to say that I'm bad. So it's safe to say that I'm bad. So it's safe to say that I'm
Micah, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Craig. Thanks for having me.
Yes, sir. This is my first time to ever get to speak with you. I've known John for a little while through social media, but other than that, this is my first time getting to meet you. But before we introduce John, why don't you give me a little bit of background of yourself, whatever you want folks to know about you?
Well, I'm sorry, you've known John for long.
I understand that statement.
So, yeah, my name's Micah. I'm a husband, father. I've got 2 kids, lovely wife. I grew up in the Baptist, independent fundamental Baptist tradition for the most part, until I was kind of last couple of years of college. And I started moving out of that tradition into just more broadly evangelical and philosophy. Spent about 10 years in kind of a semi-reformed megachurch, and about 3 years of studying the church, some of the church fathers, studying historical theology, started leading me out of that into a more kind of historical denomination. So I ended up in the LCMS, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, otherwise known as a confessional Lutheran. I'm a corporate drone, you could say, in comparison to John, who's flying by the seat of his pants out there and by himself. So yeah, I manage a sales ops team for a large healthcare corporation. I'm one of the managers there. We deal with some of our larger accounts, pays the bills. I enjoy it. What else? I enjoy mowing my lawn because that's one of the few hobbies that dads and fathers are allowed to have in the suburbs.
John, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, man, I didn't grow up in the church. Came into the faith in college. God saved me when I was a freshman in college through a parachurch Baptist student ministry. I took college at the time to actually figure out kind of like what the faith is, learn the basics, and kind of go from there. And then a few years into it, I kind of started getting wrapped into Reformed theology and that kind of thing. And haven't really strayed away from that. So I've just kind of been getting deeper into the Reformed traditions. Went and planted a church out in West Texas, rural West Texas, back in 2015. And then around 2022, moved out here to San Antonio, and been living out here for about 18 months now. And about a month or so ago, started a elder candidacy at the church that we joined since we've been here. Back in 2018, I started my own business, designing websites. Did that because I wanted to do bivocational ministry. But before all the COVID stuff happened, took over, I went full-time with the business. Everything in that field went really well during COVID. And my wife was able to go full-time with it as well. So we both operated out of the house. And now we are still doing it. But now we design websites, host websites, manage social media. And we've been doing podcast production for a while now as well.
Nice. Yeah, I guess did not know that you moved to San Antonio. For some reason, I still thought you were in West Texas. You know, like we were talking before we started recording, I grew up in West Texas. Spent a lot of my very younger years, you know, there's not a lot to do out in West Texas. So you try to go find things to do out in West Texas when you're a kid. And living in Grape Creek, Texas, there was they called it a mountain. It was Mount Nebo. It was not a mountain. It was just a giant hill. And we'd go run around on this chasing horny toads and try not to get bit by rattlesnakes. And one day we got chased off there by a a park ranger of some sort. I don't know what he was. He had a badge. He told us we weren't supposed to be up there, but we were back up there the next day. Then we built our own tree, or little clubhouses and stuff out there smoking cigarettes until we got caught doing that from Mom, and she put a stop to that. Everything we were trying to find to do out there was not what you're supposed to be doing, but a lot of boredom. Thankfully, our aunt and uncle lived right across the street from us, and they had a swimming pool. So when it was hot outside, we always had somewhere to go swimming, which is always good. And before we get into eschatology, John, I gotta ask you what your problem with the Dallas Cowboys is, first of all, because I see this on social media, and I don't know if you're a fan of a team or not, or you just watch football to pick on Dallas Cowboy fans.
It's I guess it's kind of all the above, man. I've always been a 49ers fan.
Okay, that explains it.
So that's probably where part of it comes from, yeah. Cowboys have the worst fans, man. Cowboys fans are the worst fans.
I don't know, man. Have you ever met some Eagle fans? They're pretty rough.
Eagles fans are pretty bad, man.
Our producer lives in Pennsylvania, and she's from Texas, but she's not necessarily an Eagle fan. But when she was helping me with some stuff on Zencastr, and she was getting ready to go to an Eagle watch party, I think before the NFC Championship game or something, and I was like, you're not an Eagle fan? She goes, no. I was like, okay, because I thought we were going to fire you because that was going to be a really tough relationship. And she goes, and I said, some of the Eagle fans are just so hard to deal with. And she goes, that's the whole East Coast, man. It's rough out here. It's rough. It's just it's just like that out there. So it's not just, maybe it's just the area, not just so much Eagle fans. But
when the Eagles won the Super Bowl, they rioted.
Didn't they start rioting before this year's Super Bowl, though? Didn't they start?
They started tearing the place up before the Super Bowl.
What is going on with these people?
John, have you seen San Francisco?
San Francisco is pretty bad, man. I'm not a fan of the city. I'm a fan of the team.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of the team's tradition.
Why? I am very curious, as someone who has never lived in San Francisco, why on earth you would be a fan?
When I was finally started getting into football when I was a little kid, because my dad's a diehard Packers fan. And so when I told him I was going to be a 49ers fan, he actually did get a Steelers shirt. Like, no joke. I overheard him telling my mom in the kitchen one day. But my dad was teaching me about football and sports. And I think the 49ers won. And it was like Steve Young and Jerry Rice were on the team. And he was telling me about like Joe Montana. He's telling me about the catch and all that kind of fun stuff. Because in the 90s was when the Packers started getting good for the first time in like 30 years. And he said when the Packers sucked, he would watch the 49ers because they would always beat the Cowboys.
Oh, that's right, dude.
And so I was like, all right, I guess I'm a 49ers fan.
Wait, how old are you? Because I remember back in the 90s when I went to an NFC Championship game, the Cowboys and 49ers played, and we whipped them to go when we went to the Super Bowl 3 out of 4 years. And when you said Cowboy fans are the worst, it's interesting when I hear that because we don't really ever concern ourselves with other teams. And like I don't like the Eagles. That's my least favorite team, right? But I don't really concern myself with the 49ers or the Packers or unless we're playing them. But other than that, but for some reason, it's not just you, man. I see it across social media about the Cowboys. People just, if they're not fans of the team, but they will just pick on the Cowboys. You don't hear them talking about the 49ers or the Packers or, you know what I'm saying? It's always the Cowboys. I cannot figure it out. And we just don't, maybe we sound arrogant when we say we just don't care about your team. Maybe that's the problem.
I forgot, John, because I forget that Steve Young played for the 49ers. And what's really cool is I think I keep this just for John. I've got a Steve Young ball up there on the top with his signature that was given to me by Steve Young. I wasn't the only one he was handing them out to, but I'm going to pretend that I was for a second. And I think I just keep that there just to remind John that even though I'm not really a football fan, I've got it there. Just keep him close to me.
It does bother me that ball really means nothing to you.
It was really cool. I was honored to get it because I know he's a big deal.
Do y'all live in the same area?
We used to, but I'm in DFW.
Okay, so there's no way, like if that ball comes up missing or something, you would know like it was where it's at probably.
Well, John was supposed to visit me this year, so we'll see if he manages to sneak it out while he's here.
It'd be in a good home.
Where it's cared about and deeply cared about. All right. Let's talk about eschatology a little bit because, like I mentioned before we started recording, I always understood dispensationalism to be the thing, that I didn't know there were other schools of thought on this. I'm not familiar with Amill or pre-mill. Like, I've watched one of y'all's episodes talking about this on a roundtable y'all had. I've heard about them in passing, but I never really took any time to get into them. And once I started getting in these Christian anarchist circles and talking to folks who are outside of the Southern Baptist tradition, I spent a lot of time in Southern Baptist churches. So I would talk about the rapture or talk about pre-tribulation. I was a pre-trib guy, you know, so And I can't remember who I was talking to, but he was like, that stuff's not true. And it blew me away.
Yeah.
It blew me away because I had a pastor in a Southern Baptist church I attended. There was not one Sunday that would go by that the rapture was not mentioned somewhere along during the sermon, or he maybe just talk about it constantly, you know, and it definitely was brought up at the end whenever the altar call, you know, and if you leave here today and the rapture happens, are you going to heaven? Or if you, you know, that type of preaching and stuff. And so that's all I knew. I didn't really ever bother to look that stuff up on my own because I just trusted the guys behind the pulpit telling me this, you know, and I just thought everybody believed this. It reminds me of a story of a time when I worked at the newspaper back when I lived in Arkansas, very young, very long time ago. I don't even know if these guys are still alive, but they're both Church of Christ. And I mentioned something to them about the rapture. We were talking about it, just hanging out at work, and they looked at me confused. Then one of them looked at the other. He goes, "Do you know what he's talking about?" He goes, "I have no idea what he's talking about." And that blew me away. I thought everybody knew what the rapture was, and everybody was expecting the return of Christ. You know, we're going to be caught up in the air. You know, you watch those Left Behind movies and read those books, and your clothes hit the floor and you disappear. And I was like, I believed all that stuff, but like I said, I didn't know there were other ideals out there like the Amill or pre-mill. So I want to talk about that a little bit, just for my own ignorance, really about the topics, because I don't know. One thing I've noticed when I realized that, okay, this dispensationalism school of thought is false, then I just didn't worry about it anymore. I didn't really, not saying it's not important. It just wasn't on my radar to talk about. You know, it's like, okay, so we'll just see what happens. You know, I don't think anybody really understands for sure what it's going to look like, but I just don't worry about it. You know, I trust God and Jesus to fulfill their promises, you know, so I just don't worry about it. But are you guys on the same page when it comes to this? Do y'all agree with the same thing? And if not, it would be kind of cool to kind of get both of y'all's perspectives on it. Or if so, maybe y'all can just explain both of them to me. John, do you want to start there? Or?
I'll go ahead and start a little bit. I think for the most part, generally speaking, me and Micah are pretty close to the same page on here. So sorry to disappoint you on that.
It's all good.
I mean, I will say this is probably what I consider my least informed aspect of my theology, which is kind of interesting because the eschatology roundtables have been some fairly decent popular episodes that we have had. Like, at least in the circles that I'm in right now, a lot of people are really enjoying talking about it, or they're really curious. But one of the things that seems to be really common is, especially if you were involved in some kind of evangelical circle or like some kind of like fundamentalist circle, almost everybody seems to have this story where they were taught dispensationalist eschatology and they didn't know it. And everybody seems to have thought that was just what everybody believed because that's all that they were around. And that seems to be a very common theme with a lot of people, which is really unfortunate. Like, I didn't grow up in the church, but when I was saved, the people that I was around a very generic Baptist evangelical circle. Everything, it was just, you were just taught dispensationalism. That word probably wasn't really used, but that's just what you were taught to think. And I remember the ministry leaders, they would always get up there and they would always talk about the rapture. They would always talk about that, all that kind of stuff, man, about getting raptured and was your family going to be there with you and all that different kind of stuff. And this, like, I just kind of shared in a previous episode, like one of the only time in this small town area that I was in West Texas, the only time all those churches were able to get together and cooperate was when they wanted to show the youth and the college students the Left Behind series. And so they all managed to work together and not fight and show those stupid movies to us on Friday nights. And just to get all the kids scared. And so, like, I would tell people that the eschatology, the view that best describes me is amillennialism. That is the most dominant view throughout all of Christian history. Dispensationalism wasn't invented till around the mid 1800s, and most people don't know that, and that should be alarming.
Right. Well, and when people were calling me a dispy in this, I didn't even know what that. Like you said, they weren't calling it that in church. What is a dispy? It's kind of the same thing when people were calling me a neoconservative before I started getting into libertarianism and anarchy. I didn't know I was a neoconservative. I didn't know what that meant. It was the same thing. Like nobody, you're right. Nobody was saying that in the churches. They weren't calling you dispensationalists. They say this is the Bible. This is what the Bible teaches, and they've got some verses that they can use to confuse you about it. But anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, you're good, man. But that's really common for a lot of people in their stories. They didn't know that's just what was being taught. And I mean, a lot of people don't grow up around churches and ministries that want to equip you and they want to educate you. They don't generally. It's common for you to not be taught how to think critically and how to debate or be informed or how to read the Bible. It's very common for people just to be preached at and being told what to think, as opposed to like how to be discerning, and which is actually really unfortunate.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, I would probably say like I'm Amill, most common view throughout all of church history, and so people who are Amill are not concerned about the rapture, not concerned about being left behind. Don't believe in a literal 1,000 years. We believe that the church age, which we're in now, is the 1,000 years, which is a more symbolic time frame, not a literal one. But yeah, man.
All right. So, Micah, the one you explain your stance, and then maybe y'all can explain to me what Amill is and what pre-mill is. Because, like I said, if y'all are both on the same page about it, you can explain it. But I don't know what it means when y'all say that. I've heard about it, like I said, in passing, but it's not something I've ever really looked into.
Yeah, like John said, Amill is the predominant view of church history. Majority of church fathers and medieval and other theologians held to something like that. There is some crossover. Some things are similar in the post-mill and the Amill view, but really there's the three main views. The two mostly historical views that were found in the early church, in most of the early church fathers, were pre-mill, historic pre-mill, and Amill. And they're all really the main differences there are the timing of Christ's return. So Amill, we don't expect a future literal 1,000 years, but rather view it as Christ is now reigning with his saints, and then he will at some point return. Post-mill Christian, they would believe that Christ returns after the millennium, but their system or view states that the world will get better and better. Essentially, we evangelize more of the world. It becomes more of a Christian, not necessarily a utopia, but it becomes better. And then at some point, Christ returns when I don't want to straw man them. So, but when it's at a certain point, then he returns. Pre-mill is he returns before the millennium, and then of course the deviation there would be dispensationalism, which didn't come about until, basically 18th century or 19th century America. So that splits Christ's return kind of into two parts. And they state that there is a rapture of the church. They remove the church. Like Christ comes, removes the church, and thus removes his Holy Spirit from the planet Earth to some degree. Then there's literal 7 years of tribulation and Christ's return. I mean, that's just the broad generalities. There's all sorts of minor deviations in the dispensational system. Some people are, post-trib. Some people are pre-trib. I grew up dispensational, pre-trib, premillennial, in my Baptist church. So that's how I kind of grew up. But I came around to all millennials. I had no idea there was other options out there. In fact, when I was in probably my mid years of high school, a local pastor that we were in fellowship with, like one of the kind of like-minded churches, started thinking that he basically moved to like a post-trib rapture view. Like I thought that was like denying the faith. Like that's how big a rapture was, because like I heard it mentioned an awful lot. Not as a club necessarily to beat people with, which I've heard of other people doing that, but it was more of like, a carrot, if you will, for the church. It wasn't a stick, to get people to believe, but it was a carrot for us. Oh, we're going to get out of here before the bad stuff really happens.
Yeah, that was my understanding of it too. And when I would listen to these, it terrified me, not for my own sake. I was like, well, I don't even need to worry about it. I'm going to get raptured. I'm not worried about that. What was so terrifying to me was people who did not believe it. They had not come to be saved or, believe in Jesus, and they're going to be left behind, and they're going to be here when the Antichrist is running around and doing his thing. And, that's what I was afraid of. I mean, I wasn't worried so much for myself, but I was terrified for family members, for friends, and people that were outside the Southern Baptist Church, I wasn't so much worried about them if they didn't believe in dispensationalism, whether they were going to go to heaven or hell. I never saw it as like a salvation issue. I saw it more of like they're just going to be really surprised, that when it happens, they're going to be shocked when they're raptured up, even though they didn't believe it was a thing. That's the way I viewed it. But for folks who did not believe, that terrified me. And you live in it, you want to talk about causing a lot of anxiety in a person who cares about loved ones who do not believe in Jesus. It was terrifying, man. And I hated that. It always seemed like when I was here preached, it always sounded like it was being used as a fear-based sermon. I hate fear-based theology. I can't stand it because it doesn't sound anything like Jesus to me. And, but I think that now. Back then, I would be preaching the rapture or telling people about the rapture. And if you don't get saved, what happens if you died right now? I bought into all that stuff, and it just, my first wife, she was in United Pentecostal. I don't know if y'all have ever experienced with any UPC folks, but these people, man, I went to church with her one time, and she had a couple kids, and these kids were running around the sanctuary, and I said, if either one of these kids get up and start acting like that, I'm going to wear them out. I'm not going to have that. But it was terrifying to me, and I never went back. But I asked her one time, I said, let me ask you something, because you seem like you're always so afraid of losing your salvation or getting to a point. Like I said, what happens if you commit a sin, and then this next second you die? Are you going to hell? And she said, yes. I said, does that not terrify you? I said, I don't understand how you can live a life with that kind of mentality. I mean, there's nothing in the scriptures about that. And, Jesus wasn't running around telling people that. It's, where are you getting this from? And I went to the church. I was like, oh, you're getting it from here, and she would have some folks over for Bible studies, and I would join them in the Bible study. But remember, I'm in Southern Baptist. So you got a Southern Baptist and 2 or 3 UPC folks having a Bible study. They got to the point where they stopped coming around. They stopped coming over to the house for Bible study. But anyway, yeah, just the whole. It's interesting to me. Do you guys dive into this stuff because you like the conversation? Do you think it's important? Do you think it's necessary to learn this stuff as a Christian, or is it just an interesting topic for you to learn more about? And John, you can start with that if you want.
Yes. It's kind of, I think it's kind of an accident, man. It's interesting because over the past, I think 6 months, I've been surrounded by a bunch of conversations about like eschatology, more so than I have in a really long time. I've had more people wanting to talk to me about eschatology over the past 6 months than people wanted to when COVID started. Like 2020 was like red meat for every dispensationalist walking.
Yeah.
And like, dude, everything was the Antichrist. COVID was the Antichrist. The vaccine was the Antichrist. Everything was the Antichrist. Like everything was. And so I'm kind of finding it weird that all of a sudden everybody's wanting to talk about it now when a lot of that stuff has calmed down. But honestly, man, I had a friend who me and him were talking about eschatology once, and he's like, we should get a group of people together and we'll talk about it. We'll talk about our different views and what scripture says, how you came here and that kind of thing. And I'm like, yeah, man, this sounds like a good idea. And then a couple months later, I was like, hey, what would you think if we made this an episode of the podcast? Would you be cool with that? You cool with being recorded? You cool with being on the internet for the rest of your life talking about this? Like, is that something you're fine with? And he was on board. Micah was on board with it. I've got a couple other people who were like, yeah, that'd be cool. We can go ahead and do that. And so we were able to get somebody like some people with an Amill belief, a post-mill belief, And I was able to find one Disby guy that was willing to be on it. And he's not even like a hardcore like Disby. He's just kind of like, this is what I believe. If somebody wants to change my mind, they're welcome to. He's not like really like hardcore into it. He's a good guy. And so we did one recording, and then I had like quite a few people come back to me and say, hey, they really liked it. I've got some questions. And like the number of people who've come back to me and said, I didn't know that there was other views. I was only taught what y'all were calling dispensationalism. I didn't know there was other stuff. And so like in regards to total view counts, those are not our best episodes. But as far as like, I would say like impact wise, those are probably some of our best ones. And so one episode went well. We did another one. And then we're trying to do a third one. We're trying to get another third one on the calendar. But I mean, eschatology is a weird thing. Like, do I think it's important? Like, yes. But I think some people go way too like hard into it. The kind of like the stuff that Greg, you were talking about, like with your background, like that's just too ridiculous. Like predicting the end of the world is not cool. Scaring people with the rapture isn't cool. I mean, like there's some people, it seems like their faith started with eschatology, and their faith, that's all it really is. I mean, so like it is important. But I don't think it should be like the end all be all for like everything within who you are as a Christian, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said earlier, if it's all you're hearing in church. I mean, and this was one church. I went and attended another Southern Baptist church later on. It was much bigger, and they didn't talk about it hardly at all, if any. And if they did mention something like that, it just came up. Just you knew what they were saying, but they weren't preaching the rapture's happening. And I bought into it so much at the time when I was printing newspapers. I was reading everything about Israel and watching everything that, all the world news and national news. I was watching all that stuff because of what I believed when it came to the rapture. And so I was so focused on that. And there's other things that we should be talking about, I think, as Christians, trying to get people to come to an understanding of Christ instead of trying to scare them into it. It just doesn't, I used to, and I just don't believe that's the way. It's not something I ever saw Jesus doing either.
We didn't mention it earlier, but you just mentioned it now. And like, if I'm wrong, just let me know. But generally speaking, within the Amill and post-Mill eschatologies, we don't believe that the nation of Israel has any favoritism. That seems to be a dispensationalist thing. And that's another major thing that there's a distinguishing difference on.
Yeah, the book of Revelation and then the book of Daniel are two of the main spots where dispensationalists draw a lot of their information from. I'll say information, not as a slam, but as just, is what it is. So there's a lot of apocalyptic language in there, a lot of symbolic language, a lot of things that were fulfilled in history already. So the number 666, that was code for Nero's name. It wasn't, it's not going to be some sort of tattoo on your forehead or on your hand in order to be able to go, buy and sell. The Antichrist is not necessarily one specific person, but rather there are people and there are things that are antichrist, like against Christ. They set themselves up against Christ. So there's a lot of it's almost an over-realized literalism that they apply to some of these texts that are very, very symbolic and very metaphorical in some senses. Like you've got a dragon coming out of the sea. Oh, what does that mean? Is that going to be a real dragon? Is that going to be, does that stand for something? All right. What are these locusts flying? Are they actually Apache attack helicopters? So I've heard that. And of course, if you've read Left Behind, you probably heard some similar stuff. So there's a lot of things that are kind of taken to kind of an extreme or a extreme literalism that aren't meant to be literal because the Bible is full of different genres of literature. Doesn't mean that there's nothing useful in those books for us, but it's not going to be applicable in the same ways as, say, the epistles or the Gospels. Just talking about the importance of eschatology, I think it is important. I don't consider it of first importance, but it really does have an impact on how you live your life. Like you even shared some stories about, living in fear or having people who lived in fear because of the doctrine of the rapture, or, dispensationalism. I'd say for post-mill, there's a lot of reformed that are post-mill, and that informs their beliefs and their actions. So they want to make the world more Christian and make the world a better place. So that informs how they view government and how they view the church and how they view, all these things interacting. People who fall into the dispensational camp, they tend to have a literal view of Israel. And so we need to be, they think that the church is, just this kind of parentheses in God's timeline. And eventually God's going to go back to ethnic Israel and bring them back into the fold. When, Amill and post-mill would disagree with that. So I would say there is a lot of implications for how you live your life. I'm not sure it's not at the same level as implications about your salvation or, your day-to-day kind of sanctification, but there is some implications there for, bigger picture things, I think.
Hey, are y'all familiar with John Hagee?
The blood moon stuff.
Yeah, the blood moon. Have you seen the meme that comes out with the Hagee meme that comes out with the blood moon? Did you leave out milk and cookies for Hagee for the blood moon?
I've seen that.
That meme is on my phone somewhere.
Hey folks, Craig here, and I'd like to let y'all know we are always looking for writers to contribute to our blog. I don't care if you have any experience or not. 2 or 3 of our contributors had no prior experience writing, and it turns out they have a real knack for it. Our project coordinator helps them put the articles together, and she publishes them on our website and Facebook page, and you will also have the option to come on the show and go more in depth about your article. So if you like what we're doing at The Bad Roman and would like to try your hand at writing, then send us an email at thebadromanpodcast@gmail.com. We're having a blast with this project, and we would love for you to join us in helping promote it. Now back to the show.
Do y'all want to switch to City Square a little bit and tell us what y'all are doing with that?
Yeah, man, pretty cool.
Absolutely.
Awesome. So what was the idea behind it, and what made y'all want to start a podcast? How long have y'all been doing this now?
Was it been 6 months, maybe?
I was going to say 6 months.
You have to know by now how much work goes into a podcast. It was something that was kind of surprising to me. That's why I've got different people working on the project with, doing different things. I got somebody that does show notes for us. And of course, our producer does all the artwork and she handles the website. And then she also does all the editing for the show. So it's easier for me to just get behind a microphone and scream at people, and then they can do all the other stuff with it, and I can just go to sleep.
That's kind of how I function, honestly. It's John and Emily do most of the work. I just supply them with cigars and be like, thank you. You guys are good friends.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, man. I was like, because my wife does probably most of the producing. And so we just basically pay her with cigars and memes, and it works out.
Cigars and memes for your wife? That's awesome.
Yeah.
True love.
Yeah. So what about City Square? I'm interested in the name too. The name, I love y'all's logo. I don't know, who designed that for you, but that's a pretty cool logo. And I'm kind of curious about the name, but tell me about the logo, and then tell me about City Square and what y'all are trying to do with this podcast.
You want to tell about the logo, and I'll tell the rest.
It's really related to the name of the podcast and kind of the philosophy behind it. So they're all kind of interrelated, but I'll tackle a little bit and then I'll let John jump in. We actually were really fond of the concept of the city gate or the city square. Kind of, you were thinking kind of, back in Proverbs where the elders of the city sat in the gate and had conversations and conducted business, and, and we enjoy kind of over COVID, we had a lot of conversations over Zoom and Skype and whatever we were using at the time with a bunch of friends. And we really enjoyed that a lot. And so that got our wheels turning. Do we want to do a podcast, right? So one of the problems, though, is City Gate is there's 7,000 churches that are called City Gate. And there's a lot of podcasts and a lot of online content websites that are already City Gate. So we had to kind of go back to the drawing board, toss some different ideas around. And then we kind of came on to the concept of the City Square, which is what we were looking to do. We wanted to talk to people about stuff that mattered. And we kind of wanted to focus more on the ordinary side of things. Neither of us are celebrities or ever going to be celebrities. And we didn't really want to, like Joe Rogan's super successful, right? But he's got comedians and, the who's who of every single industry is coming on his podcast. And we are talking to normal people who, if they have a podcast, they have 20 subscribers, or they maybe they run a really niche religious meme page, So the logo came about because we were kind of tossing around ideas for the name. We settled on the name, and then we started. And I say we because I really had a very, very tiny part compared to John and Emily. But we tossed around, the concepts of like different buildings and church, and you want to bring in imagery that kind of communicates what your podcast is about. So that's how we sort of ended up there. And I like the color scheme we use. We have a couple different things we go in between, and I have a shirt from one of my favorite strongmen that had a similar theme on it. So we ended up on those colors, at least initially.
Very cool. John, tell me about the show.
Yeah, man. So just kind of starting off a little bit of like what Micah said. We wanted to kind of like talk to ordinary, regular people about like their faith and their work. And so, because kind of like you were saying with the Rogan thing, and you grew up in the SBC, and so like the SBC loves conferences and that kind of stuff. And it's like you ever go to like a conference or something, you're always going to hear from the exception to every story. And so we didn't really want to, even if we could, we didn't want to tell a lot of the stories that were the exception to the rule. Like we wanted to hear the stories and the backgrounds and the journeys of the regular everyday person, the people that you can relate to, who have gone through a lot of the same struggles that you had, who whatever successes they've had are the kind of successes that regular people have. And we just kind of want to see like where like their faith and work kind of mixed together. And so, I mean, we've talked with entrepreneurs, we've talked with like small town bivocational pastors, and we've talked to people who like Micah are corporate drones trying to like to navigate through life like that. I've talked to like some small town like parachurch ministers, and so like just regular people, man, just kind of like hear like, hey, who are you? Like, where did you start? What were your stops along the way? And how did you get to where you're at now? And so like some people grew up in like fundamentalist churches, and now they've along the journey along the way, they might have like stopped. They're like, hey, like I've been studying church history. I've been studying theology. Lutheranism makes sense. Or somehow I stumbled into like Reformed theology, and like I've been plugging into like a Presbyterian church or like a Baptist church or just different things like that, man. Like I got to from when I was church planning out in West Texas, I got to have a guy on the podcast who was one of my college students when I was church planning. And now like he's an associate youth pastor at a church in Houston. And we got to share his story about like him growing up, that he grew up Catholic, and like he went to college, and talked about the time that we did ministry in West Texas, and now he's in Houston, and he's been married for a year. And like we got to talk about all that different kind of stuff. And so like, I think there's a lot of power in that, right? And so like when you look at the Bible, you see that there's a lot of stories in the Bible. Jesus told parables that were familiar to the people, and people relate to stories. They remember stories. It's easy for people to engage in stories, especially when it's a story that like that makes sense and fits to you, as opposed to the guy on stage who's just had his third book become a New York Times bestseller. And like that speaks to people, and it speaks to all of us, and we all enjoy it. It's valuable.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I love listening to Joe Rogan podcasts. I think there's a lot of interesting conversations on there as well. But I like what you guys are doing, because, I hear people say, well, I don't know if y'all call yourself libertarians or not, or whatever, but
I do.
You do you? Okay. So I don't know, but you'll hear somebody say, well, are you really a libertarian if you don't have a podcast? And then they're making jokes about it and picking on folks about everybody making a podcast. And I look at it differently. I'm always excited to see a new podcast come out, because I like the fact, that you're just having conversations with regular folks like we do on this one too. And it's people really resonate with it. they want to hear from somebody that it's kind of on their level on some things, instead of somebody that's might have 3 books or whatever, or is famous or whatever. And then there's value in those conversations too. But I think a lot of folks do really kind of latch onto that, with what we do with the Bad Roman too, just having conversations with some friends, and you're going to get different perspectives across the board. It's something that I've tried to do so much with this show, is get as many different perspectives as possible. And people can just kind of listen and pick, what makes sense to them. Because if it was just me doing a solo podcast all the time, I don't know how much of a following we would have. Probably not much. There might be some that, a few that hang out and listen to Craig scream into a microphone, but I don't know for sure that it would be very many. And we've done pretty well over the past 3 years. We've got several subscribers. I don't know the exact number, but just across the board, I know there's a bunch. I know by all the messages I get from folks too that have latched onto it. So I think it's really cool what y'all are doing, and I want to encourage you to keep doing it. Because it can drag you down trying to keep it going and stuff. But the long, you've been doing it for 6 months, we're going on just now 3 years of publishing episodes. And sometimes it turns, I had a guy on the show and he goes, sometimes it feels, and he's doing his own editing and he's doing all of his own stuff for his own podcast. He goes, sometimes it feels like a second job. And I don't do all that stuff, but sometimes it feels like a second job. And usually when I'm complaining about that, it's during our busy season at work, when I'm working 60 plus hours a week, and trying to fit in a podcast episode to keep our commitments to publish every 2 weeks, so everybody knows there's going to be a Bad Roman episode every 2 weeks. But at the same time, I find a lot of joy in doing this too, getting to talk to everyday people and getting to meet new folks like Micah here, so I feel like I've made a new friend now, and we'll see what happens later on. He's not a football fan, so we could probably remain friends. I don't know how long mine and your relationship's going to last, John, but we'll see how that goes next football season.
Every time the Cowboys is a game, man, I'll be there.
I kind of support John and his haterade consuming. It's fun because, people get salty, but everyone knows he's just messing around at this point. So got to make some new friends, John, so they think you're being serious.
I don't really take it serious. Some of it is pretty funny. I mean, there was a time in my life as a Cowboy fan that I was very sensitive to stuff like that. And now I just kind of laugh about it because, speaking of the COVID stuff, whenever all that was going on, they shut down sports, and then they started bringing it back with piped in crowd noise and cardboard cutouts in the stand and stuff. I just quit watching. I could not watch it. And I didn't watch football an entire year. I tried one game, the very first game of the season. The Cowboys were playing the Rams in LA, and there were cardboard cutouts in the stands, and they were piping in crowd noise. And I'm like, and there was one game somebody told me during the Patriots were playing somebody, and the piped in crowd noise was booing a referee's call. And they were like, the announcer's like, the crowd didn't like that call. And the guy's like, there's no crowd.
Yeah, man,
it's not a crowd. It was brutal. I'm a big college basketball fan. And, living in Fayetteville, Arkansas for 25 years, I became a huge Razorback fan, and that year I took off for the SEC tournament to watch the Razorbacks. The Razorbacks played Vanderbilt, beat Vanderbilt. The next day, they shut it down. And I got back to work, and I was like, how'd that tournament go for you? And this is before anybody really knew what was going on with COVID, And I was like, I couldn't believe it. I mean, I had all this planned for the weekend to watch basketball for 4 days, and they shut it down. I was so angry.
The first time I knew that the COVID stuff was like bullshit was, because there was all sorts of uncertainty and like, we don't know what's going on and everyone's going to die. And, we'll just do what the government says. And, the first time I realized that there was nothing to it was when my daughter couldn't go to her classroom. She couldn't go to her new school, but her daycare hosted a virtual classroom. So she could go to be in a classroom at her daycare with a whole bunch of other kids, all on their iPads, looking at, with their teachers at different schools in an empty classroom, teaching them. And these are kindergartners and first grade and second grade. And I looked at my wife and and I said something I'm not going to say on air. It's like, what the heck is going on? She can't be in that classroom with those kids, but she can be in this classroom with these kids. Like that was the first time that I was like, oh, the emperor has no clothes.
Yeah. I mean, when it first started, I didn't buy into it at all. I mean, I understood, I'm giving grace to some folks that were worried about it and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. But I was like, wait a second, it's flu season. What is going on here? I didn't buy into it. And I never, I'm highly claustrophobic. So the whole mask thing was something that I battled for a long time because I couldn't wear one. I had to go through a whole lot of stuff at work on that. And my doctor wrote me a note. She tried to get me to wear a face shield and she saw how I reacted to it. I said, you don't understand the proximity to something like that on my face is going to freak me out. And so she was very helpful in letting me get me around all that stuff. And when they were trying to make us wear them at work and all this stuff. So that was cool. But, I didn't buy into it. I didn't. I never did. And I'm happy now that people are kind of waking up to it, realizing that, okay, we've been lied to. But are you going to remember this the next thing, when the next thing comes up? Are you going to remember what they did to us during COVID? Are you going to remember that? I don't think you will. All right. Before I let you guys go, I've really enjoyed this, but we talked a little bit before we started recording. Now, you're Lutheran, Micah, and you said you're Reformed, and I'm neither. But so when I listen to Reformed folks talk and Lutherans talk, there's a lot of similarities in some of the language that you guys use, but there's got to be some differences. Could you maybe tell me what the differences might be? The
two biggest differences are probably on baptism and the Lord's Supper. And I'm still trying to understand the Lutheran side of this because I just have a hard time understanding it. They believe that, in a sense, that the bread and the wine, in a sense, is the body and blood of Christ, but not the same way the Catholics believe it. Whereas within the Reformed traditions, we don't believe that the bread and the wine are his physical body, but we do believe that Christ is present in the partaking. And within the Reformed tradition, there is not a belief that baptism does save, but in a certain way, the Lutherans do believe that. And within the Reformed tradition, there is a lot of disagreement. Some Reformed people baptize babies like Presbyterians do, but Reformed Baptists don't baptize babies. They practice believers' baptism. Those would probably be the two biggest differences. We both love Martin Luther. That's a big commonality.
The question is, would Martin Luther love you? I don't even know if he'd like me.
He would, man, because we would have no issue having a beer together, and we would both talk crap about the Pope together.
That's true.
So we'd be fine, man.
Yeah. So I think in the scholastic debates and in the more like theological debates, the big issue is over Christology, which I honestly probably can't get into because it's way beyond my pay grade. But because there are these two elements of disagreement, mainly over the Lord's Supper and baptism, there are implications for that in these other doctrines like Christology and ecclesiology and that sort of thing. So doctrine of who Christ is and how he, relates to us and how he comes to us, and the doctrine of, how the church functions, that sort of thing. And there's a lot of different Lutheran groups as well. So there's the largest synod in the U.S. is the ELCA, which is a very liberal synod, very liberal in every area you could think they're liberal in, they are liberal in. And then I'm part of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is a very conservative and conservative theologically and what we call confessional body. There are a few others like the Wells, which is the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, and there are some smaller ones as well that are in fellowship with one or the other. So yeah, I'd say the main how those differences in Christology flesh out are the Lord's Supper and baptism. Lutherans, we at the bottom, we get to the bottom of our theology and we really just want to say, this is what the Bible says, and in a very simple manner. This is what the Bible says, and I believe it. So when Jesus says to his disciples, take and eat, this is my body, Lutherans say, okay, Jesus says this is his body. So we believe that. However, he was also holding a piece of bread. So it is therefore, in Lutheran theology, we consider that to be both bread and his body. And we consider the wine to be both wine and his blood. And we would then stop and say, we don't know how that happens, but we believe Jesus could do what he wants, and we trust his word. With Roman Catholics, And let me just go back a little bit. The real presence, that's kind of what's referred to as the real presence, or some people would say physical presence, even though that's not a term that Lutherans would want to use. That real presence of some sort is kind of the majority historical view. So Anglicans, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Orthodox Christians, and other some Reformed denominations as well would hold to those. So it's really the majority view in history and in the global church. How that functions varies a little bit according to church bodies. So just for example, the Roman Catholics, they believe in transubstantiation, which they say when the words of institution are uttered by the priest or the pastor, then it ceases to be bread and wine and becomes only body and blood. So there's a different philosophical approach to it there. With some Reformed, they would say we are spiritually partaking. It's not Christ's real body and blood, but we partake spiritually, and there's a spiritual reality that we're not fully able to understand. So, and then of course your theology there does have implications on how, you live your life. Does that forgive sins? Does the act of eating and drinking forgive sins? And it's really, there's a whole rabbit hole of awesome, in my opinion, awesome, symbology and, meaning there. But I would take up a lot of time, I think. So, and I'm underqualified to speak about a lot of this stuff. So,
well, maybe y'all can answer this for me then. Was it actual wine? Because my Southern Baptist preacher told me it was grape juice.
So it wasn't grape juice until I think around the 1850s.
Okay. And I think that's how old he was.
It was a Methodist minister that actually started that.
Really?
And that's who Welch's grape juice is named after.
Really?
Yeah. I didn't know that until about a year ago.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. I had on our Facebook page, I don't even remember what our post was about, but this guy came on and said they weren't actually drinking wine. It was juice. I'm like, I don't know, man. It says wine. It says Jesus turned water into wine. I mean, it didn't.
They didn't have refrigeration. So good luck trying to keep grapes from, not fermenting with no refrigeration.
Yeah.
So, it's silly.
They almost start fermenting immediately.
It's really silly. Now they can argue about alcohol content if you want, but when Jesus turned water into wine as his first miracle, and the guests at the wedding came up and said, dude, that's the best wine we've ever had. After they had well drunk, they didn't come up to him and say, dude, we feel so good. We're having such a good time. This grape juice is lit. Like, you don't get happy off of grape juice, unless you've been on like a fast for 40 days and you want some sugar.
Yeah.
It just doesn't hold water. The grape juice arguments, it just doesn't hold water.
Yeah, man. Like pasteurization didn't start till less than 200 years ago. It's just ridiculous. It's insane actually to argue that it was actually just regular grape juice. Jesus made good drink.
I didn't believe him when he was saying it. But I wasn't going to argue with him about it either. But for some reason, he made it a point to say that it was grape juice. And when we did do the Lord's Supper, we were drinking grape juice and having a cracker. We weren't having wine. And you don't do that in a Southern Baptist church. There's a joke about Southern Baptists showing up to the liquor store. You're not. I can't even remember how the joke goes, but it's pretty funny. Or maybe you're Catholic. If you're Catholic, you'll say hi to somebody in a liquor store. If you're Baptist, you're gonna act like you don't know them. You're gonna ignore them.
Yeah, it's like if you take a Baptist fishing, you got to take two of them, because if you take one, he'll drink your beer. But if you take two of them, then you're safe.
That's great. Well, I started following you guys on Instagram, but where else can folks find y'all at as far as, social media, where we can find your podcast? I know y'all are on YouTube, but where else?
Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. If you wanted to get into alt media, we're also on Rumble and Odyssey.
Right on.
We're on Spotify too. And we upload to all the major podcasting platforms like Apple Podcasts and all that sort of thing. So we do have a link tree we can send you that has a list of all those there.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we might, when we get ready to publish the episode, I'll show notes. I'll get that from you guys. Awesome, guys. I appreciate you taking the time and coming on and speaking. We've been trying to do this for a couple of weeks now. And John had some unexpected guests and he got sick, and then now here we are today, but we got it done. Go check out City Square Podcast.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for having us on.
Yes, sir. I'll talk to y'all soon.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Bad Roman Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts to never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, it really helps people find us. 100% of donations are given to local charities in Memphis, Tennessee. To learn more about the Bad Roman Project and to find show notes, please visit thebadroman.com.